Everyone assumed they knew who the last man was. They believed he dropped her home just before 10.
It may be time to rethink the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. From the start, a common assumption was that this was a relatively amateur operation. Premeditated, yes, but not that sophisticated.
2 minutes later, she was inside and safe. That is what the public was told. That is what most people still believe. But a retired FBI supervisory special agent, a man who spent his entire career inside the behavioral analysis unit profiling the worst crimes in this country, just pointed investigators toward a different man entirely. A man who was alone with Nancy Guthrie for far longer than 2 minutes. And what he says happened during that time is worth examining if we are to find Nancy. For 87 days and counting. One name has sat at the center of every conversation about the last confirmed moments of Nancy Guthrie's life.
We are going to talk about now the search for Nancy Guthrie, and it continues. Pima County Sheriff says that he is holding out hope.
Tommaso Cioni, son-in-law, husband of Annie Guthrie, the man who drove Nancy home from a family dinner on the evening of January 31st, 2026. The man whose car triggered a garage door timestamp at 9:48 p.m. and again at 9:50 p.m. The man the Pima County Sheriff's Department has publicly cleared, along with every other member of the immediate Guthrie family. 2 minutes. Garage opens, garage closes. Nancy is home. That version of events has dominated public understanding of this case from the beginning. The focus has stayed fixed on that 2-minute window, on that driveway, on that final goodbye between an 84-year-old woman and the son-in-law who dropped her at her door. It is the last confirmed data point before the darkness of February 1st swallowed everything. What almost nobody has stopped to examine is what happened earlier that same evening. Because before Tommaso drove Nancy home, someone else had her alone in a vehicle. At 5:32 in the afternoon on January 31st, Nancy Guthrie stepped into an Uber. She was headed to Annie's house for dinner. The driver picked her up, transported her across Tucson, and delivered her safely. By every account that emerged from the investigation, the ride was completely unremarkable. The driver cooperated fully with law enforcement. Investigators reviewed everything captured inside that vehicle, Nancy's words, her demeanor, every interaction with the driver, and found nothing of substance. Nothing irregular. The ride was, in the words of investigative reporter Dave Mack speaking on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, an ordinary evening. Law enforcement cleared that driver early. The public followed. The narrative moved on to Tommaso, to the garage door, to the masked man who materialized on Nancy's doorbell camera in the early hours of February 1st and changed everything. But clearing one Uber driver is not the same thing as closing the book on the Uber driver theory entirely. And a veteran FBI profiler, a man who built his career reading cases exactly like this one, just made that distinction in terms that every person following this investigation needs to hear. The question was never simply whether the specific driver who took Nancy to dinner that evening was responsible. The question this profiler is now placing directly on the table is what any driver, any person who had ever been alone in a vehicle with Nancy Guthrie, even briefly, even weeks or months before February 1st, would have been able to learn about her life in a single conversation. Where she lived, that she lived alone, that her daughter was one of the most recognized faces in American television news, that an 84-year-old woman returning home after an evening with family would be predictable, accessible, and completely unprotected. That is the theory. The man raising it spent his career at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the same unit that built the science of criminal profiling in this country. His name is Jim Clemente, and what he is saying about how this suspect found Nancy Guthrie is more grounded, more specific, and more chilling than anything that has come out of an official press conference in 87 days. If you are still here and you want to hear everything the profiler said, and trust me, it only gets more disturbing from this point forward, I want to kindly ask you to like this video and share it with someone right now, because they need to hear the truth about this case. They need to know what is actually being said behind the headlines. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, do that now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single update. Your support is what keeps this coverage going. Jim Clemente is not a television commentator offering theories for entertainment. He is a retired FBI supervisory special agent who served inside the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the division of the FBI responsible for studying violent crime across the United States and much of the world, training law enforcement agencies internationally and building the behavioral science frameworks that investigators use when a suspect has no name and no face.
When Clemente reads a case, he is reading evidence. Not headlines, not social media theories, evidence. And what he said about the Nancy Guthrie abduction, specifically about the category of person most likely responsible, needs to be understood precisely because it has been widely oversimplified in public discussion. Clemente did not accuse the Uber driver who transported Nancy on January 31st. He was explicit on that point. What he described is something more specific and far more instructive about how this abduction was likely planned and executed. His assessment is that the suspect almost certainly had some form of prior contact with Nancy Guthrie. Not a deep relationship, not necessarily someone she would have recognized or remembered. What Clemente described is what investigators call transitory contact, a brief, seemingly innocent interaction that gave the suspect access to critical information about Nancy's life without triggering any alarm. The categories he named were precise. A repair person, a plumber, an electrician, someone who worked on the roof, cleaned the pool, or maintained the lawn, a delivery driver, and specifically an Uber or Lyft driver. Any one of these interactions, Clemente explained, would have been enough. A single conversation. Information volunteered naturally and innocently by an 84-year-old woman who had absolutely no reason to guard herself against a driver making small talk on the way across Tucson. That is how this suspect likely learned what he needed to know. That is how he identified Nancy as a target. That is how a plan was built around a woman the suspect may have encountered only once, briefly, long before the night of February 1st. Which means the Uber driver angle is not a closed chapter in this investigation. It is an open category, one that includes every service interaction Nancy Guthrie had in the weeks, months, and potentially years leading up to her abduction.
But Clemente did not stop there, because alongside the transitory contact framework, he raised a second possibility that cuts directly to the heart of this case's most distinctive and puzzling feature. The ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case were not sent privately to the family. They were sent to media outlets. TMZ received one. 2 Tucson television stations received versions. The demands were made publicly and anonymously in a case that had already become one of the most watched stories in the country. Clemente pointed out that in virtually every kidnapping case involving a ransom demand that he encountered across his FBI career, the perpetrator demanded privacy, secrecy, no media, no police. The standard playbook for a ransom kidnapping is built entirely around avoiding attention, because attention brings law enforcement, and law enforcement ends the operation. This suspect did the opposite.
He sent the notes to the press. He made sure Savannah Guthrie would see them. He made sure the public would see them. Savannah responded publicly. She made videos. She appealed directly to whoever was holding her mother. And Clemente's behavioral read on those choices is this. What this person wanted was not simply money. What this person wanted was Savannah Guthrie's direct, personal attention. And they got it. The theory Clemente raised is that the person responsible may fit the behavioral profile of a celebrity stalker, someone who developed a fixation on Savannah Guthrie, who felt in their own mind that some kind of connection existed between them, and who targeted Nancy as a mechanism to force Savannah into direct communication. That is not speculation dressed up as analysis. That is a behavioral profile built directly on the specific, documented choices this suspect made before, during, and after the abduction. It reframes the entire motive structure of this case, and it changes the profile of who investigators should be looking for in ways that have not yet been fully absorbed by the public conversation around this investigation. There is also another thing we need to note carefully.
Recall that there were two distinct blood spatter patterns near Nancy's front door. Clemente's analysis of those patterns produced a reconstruction of her final moments that is both precise and deeply difficult to absorb.
Nancy complied inside the house. A handgun was visible in a holster on the doorbell camera footage. The suspect was masked, covered, and arrived in the early hours of the morning. Clemente's assessment is that Nancy, an 84-year-old woman woken in darkness by a masked armed intruder, most likely got out of bed and went downstairs, and that this compliance is entirely consistent with the absence of any evidence of a struggle inside the home. The gun controlled her. The struggle happened somewhere else. It happened at the door. When Nancy reached the threshold and understood she was not simply being controlled inside her own home, she was being taken away from it, she made a decision. She refused. Clemente described it in plain terms. She put up her last stand at the front door. The suspect struck her. Clemente's assessment is that the blow landed on her face, mouth, nose, or both. She went down. Her face came within inches of the ground. She aspirated blood and coughed it up from that position, which produced the medium-velocity droplets with hollow bubble rings visible in the crime scene photographs. Those rings form when air is present in the blood droplet. They are consistent with coughing. Not a gunshot, not a blunt force wound to the skull. The blood at that threshold is a record of exactly what her body went through in that moment.
Then the blood tells investigators something else. The trail toward the end of the walkway disappears. Not gradually, it essentially stops before the road. Clemente's reading is that after Nancy fell, the suspect picked her up and carried her face upward toward a waiting vehicle. Face up meant the blood from her injuries was no longer falling forward onto the ground, which is precisely why the trail ends where it ends. Now consider the 42-minute window alongside all of that. The suspect appeared on Nancy's doorbell camera at approximately 1:47 in the morning. Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her Apple devices at 2:28 a.m., 42 minutes between those two timestamps. And Clemente made a point about that window that challenges one of the most persistent theories in this entire case. A getaway driver is someone you leave waiting outside because the operation is built for speed. 90 seconds in and out. You do not leave a getaway driver sitting in a vehicle for 42 minutes. That is not how a coordinated multi-person abduction operates.
The blood spatter evidence at the threshold supports the same conclusion. One smear pattern, not multiple shoe prints moving through the blood. No physical evidence of more than one person at that door. Clemente was direct. If two people had been in control of an 84-year-old woman, they would not have allowed her to fall to the ground. The fact that she fell is evidence that one person momentarily lost physical control. That is the signature of a single abductor, not a coordinated team. And that single abductor made critical mistakes that Clemente believes will ultimately lead to his identification. A light-colored outfit for a night operation, reflective backpack straps on a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, a product sold exclusively through one major retailer, which means the FBI can trace purchase records. And when he raised his hand toward the camera, he may have exposed a wrist tattoo. These are not the choices of a professional. They are the choices of someone who believed they were prepared and demonstrated in every detail that they were not. Right now, hair evidence recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the same one that was initially sent to a private laboratory in Florida, is now at the FBI's laboratory at Quantico.
And according to Coffindeffer, it is not at one lab. It is currently being analyzed at 5 separate laboratories. 5 labs signal more than one sample. It signals investigators are examining more than just hair. The forensic picture being assembled at Quantico right now is broader and more complex than anything the public has been told. That matters for what comes next, because Jim Clemente identified forensic genetic genealogy as the single most promising investigative tool currently active in this case. If investigators have isolated a usable DNA profile from the evidence recovered at Nancy's home, forensic genetic genealogy allows them to upload that unknown profile to a public genetic database and build a family tree around it, working backward through generations until a potential suspect emerges. It is the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of failure through conventional investigation.
Clemente was careful with his timeline, but specific. If a clean profile has been isolated from the evidence, the suspect's name, age, and address could be in investigators' hands within weeks. The conditional is important. It depends entirely on whether a clean, usable profile exists. But with DNA now being processed across 5 separate laboratories, the evidence of serious active forensic pursuit is not ambiguous.
What remains genuinely open? The question at the center of this entire investigation is who that DNA belongs to. Someone with a passing connection to Nancy's life. Someone whose name she may never have known. Someone who sat across from her, listened to her talk about her daughter, understood exactly what kind of access that represented, and built a plan around it. The DNA at Quantico does not know about the public narrative. It does not know which theories trended and which ones faded. It only knows who was in that house on the night of February 1st. And when it speaks, the answer may be far closer and far more ordinary than anyone has been prepared to consider. Until the masterminds behind this abduction are identified and caught, until Nancy Guthrie is found, until her family finally gets the answers they have been waiting for since February 1st, the investigators working this case will not stop. Neither will we, and neither, we believe, will you. So if you have not already subscribed to this channel, do it now and click the notification bell. That way you will be among the first to hear every new development in this case the moment it drops. And do not forget to check out our other videos on this channel. There is more coverage of this case and others that deserve the same level of attention. We will see you in the next one.